U.S. intelligence are working alongside troops during attacks on the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Well, in fact, now they've discovered a list of 173 suicide bombers who were trained to attack various countries in Europe. Now, it isn't known yet whether some of these men, whose personal details are now outlined on that list, have already entered the continent. Interpol has asked all investigative agencies around the world to check whether or not some of these names are already on their own watch list. This as the Islamic State starts to collapse. Well, European countries are particularly worried that the so-called lone wolf attackers by some of these solitary attackers will still continue with more frequency. Take a look at this map. It shows you a list of where some of these suicide bombers are from around the world. North Africa, the Gulf countries, Tajikistan, Bangladesh, France, Germany, Bosnia, Netherlands, Belgium. Now, these are some of the areas where these suicide bombers are listed. Now, over the last few years, estimates also place that the number of Islamists who've joined ISIS in Syria and Iraq are now at 6,000. That's right, 6,000 people joining the terror organization. Now, many have been killed, several others arrested, but officials fear that the remaining foreign fighters in ISIS may have been radicalized already and are returning to Europe with more carnage on their mind. So this is not game over just yet. So the U.S. is coming up with this list of 173 bombers. Let's now go straight to WION's correspondent Daniele Pagani, joining us in the newsroom with the very latest. Daniele, this list is exhaustive. It shows the countries, but the threat of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and many of the other organizations around the world still far from over.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I would like to point out that inside this list there are 132 Iraqi-born nationals, and this is a major threat for Iraq and for the Middle East. God knows where they are. I mean, some of them, I imagine, having witnessed personally the level of destruction of Mosul, died, perished in battle. But if they are freely moving around Iraq, they do pose a major threat for a country where the Islamic State is not yet defeated, especially in the hearts and minds of some of the Sunni tribes living there. Then on the other side, of course, it is a major threat also for European countries and Western countries and Central Asian countries. It is a major threat for Bangladesh. Interestingly, there are names coming from Bangladesh, and I recall that when I spent there months in September, October and November, I remember talking with the head, the chief of the federal police of Mahmur, which is a relevant town closer to Mosul in the northern part of Iraq, and he told me that they were worried because the number of Bangladeshis fighting within the ranks of the Islamic State was very high. So they were trying to understand how to manage this situation with the Bangladeshi government. As of now, we don't know where these people currently are. What we know is that these people were trained to perpetrate attacks in their countries of origin, and this is definitely a threat.
Daniel, let me also follow up with you really quickly on this story. With regards to this list, I mean, the U.S. sometimes has these lists, the specially designated terrorists. The U.S. is proactive in doing so. Of course, combating ISIS is a huge priority for the U.S. government as well as other world leaders. We've seen a spate of attacks, particularly in Europe. Even recently this year, several attacks in London. Of course, what happened in Belgium and France a few years ago. Why is Europe that hotbed? Why are they attracting so many radical terror groups?
Well, this is a very good question. I think personally that segregation and isolation is one of the major origin. When I say these, I recall the theory of Olivier Rah, who is the major, perhaps the largest, the biggest and the most important expert on terrorism. Europe has an enormous amount of Muslims, and many of them living well integrated and happily with the Europeans, but a small part of them, unfortunately, due to the racist attitude of certain provinces within European countries, are marginalized. And they are radical elements, and not because they are religiously radical elements, but because life posed them in a marginalized situation. Many of the attackers that we have seen were for instance, using drugs, not going very often to mosques. So these already radicalized people, marginalized people, take Islam as a sort of way through which they can express their frustration, and on this very sentiment of frustration, these organizations like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda do build their so-called lone wolves. So why Europe? Europe because unfortunately some of the Muslims living there are marginalized and pushed at the margins, and these make them vulnerable to extremist theorists.
All right, Daniele Pagani, getting us the very latest on that. Thank you for those updates.